let me set the stage. You got $100 to drop on a car, and you want one that'll show it to all those other people in the shopping center. And you also want to have a car that can show it to all those people on the off-road trails. Which means the only car you can get, it isn't a car. It's a Land Rover. Before we can talk about the Land Rover company, we have to talk about the Land Rover. Because you see, after World War II, the Rover company designer, Marsarius Wilks, saw the Willys Jeep and said, hey, why don't we make one of those? Now, the original plan was to use industrial tractor basics and then merge that idea with an off-road truck. And after a lot of prototyping, they came up with the original Land Rover in 1948, retrospectively called the Series 1. It was simple, it was all-wheel drive, and it was a strong, sturdy workhorse for the average farmer. To be honest, it was only supposed to be a cash buffer until Rover restarted car production after World War II. However, then they found out that the Land Rover was more popular than most of their cars. So they split Land Rover into its own brand underneath the Rover group. It was a basic vehicle, shall we say, when it was launched in the 40s. It was steel with wood, it had 50 horsepower, it was rugged, practical, and could store a lot of stuff. In fact, the design was so good that the same dimensions were used for the next 25 years. Of course, those dimensions didn't stay consistent necessarily between models. There were short wheelbase versions, pickup truck versions, and station wagon versions. The station wagon was actually quite unique because it had 10 seats, which thereby the UK road tax means it's a bus and was exempt from said UK road tax. Quite clever, actually. But if you wanted to be fancy, you could get a luxury version from Tickford, which had fancy interiors, leather seats, and a tin-coated spare wheel cover. We live on the fancy farm life here. But when the Series 2 came out, the, I guess, sequel, in 1958, it didn't really change. Like I said, the dimensions and most of the underpinnings stayed the same for 25 years. But it did get a new 72 horsepower V8, with even more versions. There were the usual Series 1s that I mentioned, but there were tracked variants, tractor-wheeled variants, ambulances, fire trucks, recovery vehicles, heavy-duty trucks, even railway versions. And in the military, it was used in the Korean War and the Suez Canal crisis, with the Pink Panther Scouts being particularly legendary among the ambulances, transport buggies, and mounted recoilless rifle firers. But if you're not at war, and you want something a bit special, a bit rarer, you get the Stage 1 V8. It was a creation of Bruce McWilliams, who was assisted and sponsored by GT40 designer Ken Miles. It had a 3.5-liter Leyland V8, making up to 135 horsepower, and it was their attempt to raise some sales, which clearly didn't work because these are among the rarest original Land Rovers in the world. Which brings us to the final generation of the original Land Rover, the Series 3, which was the most successful Land Rover by far up to this point, with 70,000 sold a year and almost 500,000 by the end of production. Which isn't a surprise given the fact that it was the same great workhorse, but now it actually had a good interior that wasn't from a coach builder. Wow! But if you did still need to do the truly hard work on the farm, you could get into a heavy-duty pickup version. Which meant that, all in all, the millionth Land Rover went off the line in 1976. And Land Rover decided to branch out a bit with the Range Rover, retrospectively called the Classic. Rover saw the Ford Bronco and the Jeep Grand Wagoneer as an opportunity to expand into the more luxurious SUV lifestyle. A vehicle that could be very comfortable in traffic while still being able to tear up trails, because the common misconception is that off-roaders have massive suspension, therefore they are comfortable, and that is a flat-out lie. Don't believe that. Jeeps are incredibly uncomfortable. But this one would be a true comfort wagon. It was tall, it was luxurious, the body was made out of a single sheet of aluminum to increase strength and reduce weight. It was a 2-door or a 4-door, and it was so good looking that the Paris Louvre showed it at one of its exhibits. Cool. It was actually marketed as a car for all reasons, and it worked. It had a relatively fast, for the time and for the vehicle, 0 to 60 of just under 15 seconds, while still being able to wade through water and go up mountains. Sure, on a day-to-day basis, the British engineering of the 70s meant it wasn't very reliable. However, when it was off-road, it was a whole nother story. It won its class twice at the Dakar Rally, and it was the first vehicle ever to bridge the Darien Gap driving from North America to South America. It was also in the Camel Trophy, which we'll come to later on, but in the meantime, we have to talk to a more hardcore off-roader. It was called the 90, or the 110, or the 127, depending on the wheelbase. But most people now know it as the Defender. It was meant to replace the original series Land Rovers. It featured the same 4-cylinder and V8 options as before, but now it had new fuel injection, which meant they were up to 134 horsepower. And in 1986, the diesels got an optional turbocharger, boosting torque by over 30%. It was still available in pickup truck and van bodies, but the Land Rover became more of a private utility company in their own world. But if you want to be a bit crazy, Land Rover set up their own special vehicles division, which specialized in custom-built-to-order 110s, like the 6x6 conversion, stretch versions, amphibious version, and of course government contracts, which were used in the military as ambulances, rapid mobility transport, mine detectors, and Rapier missile launchers. Yeah. While the 110 was being rebadged as the Defender in 1990, Land Rover launched another model, meant to replace the Range Rover. Called the Discovery in 1989, it still actually used the same Range Rover platform and much of its styling cues. However, because manufacturing got better, it became cheaper, which meant it sold better. It was a massive success. Not only because it was incredibly capable on the road for grocery shopping, but it kept that still original off-roading Defender style. It was so popular, it earned the nickname the Disco. Of course, it wouldn't be until the Disco 3 that it saw a brand new chassis and fully independent suspension, as it continued its off-road prowess and was crowned the best 4x4 of all time. It is still available today, being in production since 1989 with the optional 340 horsepower supercharged Jag V6. Oh, and did I mention it was the vehicle of choice for the Camel Trophy? I told you we'd come back to it. Believe it or not, the Camel Trophy did not start out with Land Rovers. It started out with a bunch of Jeeps. You see, when Camel Cigarettes formed the trophy in 1980 as an advertising campaign, a group of Germans rented 3 local CJ5 Jeeps and tried to cross the Trans-Amazonian Highway. They didn't make it. However, when they came back to Germany, they were hailed as heroes, and the interest in off-roading exploded. And as the number of applicants grew, the event morphed from a German competition to a global competition. It was called the Olympics of 4x4. They traveled to almost every hemisphere on Earth, places like Chile, Borneo, Australia, the Amazon, Malaysia, even the Soviet Union. They were the first international motorsports in history to go to the USSR when they traveled to Siberia. Each trophy has up to 16 different teams with representatives from dozens of nations competing in various special challenges to earn points. But unlike the actual Olympics, the challenge isn't so much the challenges, it's getting to them. because the Camel Trophy had the most brutal off-roading in history. Some trips would take over 12 hours just to go half a mile, crossing rivers, waterfalls, and maybe you can call them roads. They're just mud pits, feet deep of mud everywhere, and you're trying to get a truck through it. And it is a hellish journey, but that was the challenge. That was the allure of the Camel Trophy. And Land Rover wanted in on it, so they became their primary sponsor in 1981. And let me tell you, these things were fantastic. They were modified from the factory, with roll cages, waterproof electronics, winches, snorkel, beefed up steering, tires, suspension, bull bars, auxiliary fuel tanks, and every off-road accessory you can possibly need to travel over any terrain in the world. And to top it off, every single one was painted in a sweet sand glow paint scheme. These things look amazing. The first few vehicles were Range Rovers and 110s. However, as the trophy progressed throughout the years, they switched to the Discovery from 1990 on. Of course, one vehicle always was the backup, if you will. One vehicle always was there. The Defender. It was used as a support vehicle for every single Camel Trophy adventure. Up until 1998, when the event shifted from pure off-road skill to emphasis on other challenges like swimming, biking, and rock climbing. And Land Rover ended their partnership after that. Of course, they did launch their own successor called the G4 Challenge in 2003. And you can win an actual Land Rover if you won it. Of course, 2008 came knocking, and financing a cool off-road trip just for some publicity did not seem the most financially viable, and that too was discontinued. So, with the awesomeness and brutal off-roading that I can't put into words, so I just have it going on in the background right now, we should move on to the current Defender, shall we say. Because after the 110 was renamed the Defender in 1990, it got a whole host of new things. A new diesel engine allowed high-speed cruising while still capable of towing heavy loads. And in South Africa, you could get a BMW 2.8-liter i6 making 200 horsepower, which apparently had a top speed in excess of 100 miles an hour, which sounds terrifying in a Land Rover because they're not very stable. Regardless of how stable it was, the Defender was so successful. Virtually no major changes were made until 2016, when it was finally discontinued. Just in time for the 2019 release of the new Defender. Sure, it doesn't look like the iconic boxy styling of old, but it's still a Defender. It can still tackle most terrain you want. Sure, it's more focused for the parking lot now, but it is still the off-road capable vehicle you want. There's even a mild hybrid version that makes 400 horsepower that can get 22 mpg. But if you think that's a little too polished for you, a little too uptight with the times, and you want something old school, you could get the Works 70th anniversary. This thing, big shocker, was built to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Defender. So Land Rover built 150 bespoke resto mods of original Defenders. They had new springs, new dampers, new brakes, and off-road tires. Oh, and the engine went from a puny 200 horsepower i6 or diesel V8 to a naturally aspirated 5-liter Jaguar V8 making 400 horsepower and almost 500 torque. The thing's a beast. It's awesome. It's a shame they only made 150 of them because it's an amazing machine. The same cannot be said about their current lineup, to be honest, because they really have emphasized luxury compact SUVs. I mean, the Range Rover is still their largest off-road capable SUV. It's still able to go up sand dunes while going to the parking lot. It's still massive and comfortable and has the styling cues from the original. But, to be honest, their best-selling vehicles are the Evoque, or the Disco, or the Velour. Their smaller, compact, crappy SUVs are just selling like hotcakes, so I guess in all fairness, they're making more of them. Hell, they're even making sport SUVs. They're one of the early pioneers of sport SUVs with the Range Rover Sport SVR. They took the standard issue Range Rover Sport and then gave it a massive supercharged V8, making almost 600 horsepower and 515 torque, which means the 2.5-ton SUV can do 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds and have a top speed of 176. Just because physics can get the middle finger, I guess. But don't worry. If you think that Land Rover has lost their way, and is just focusing on mom-and-pop SUV compact crap, there's always the purist in-house tuning shop of Bowler. Founded by Drew Bowler, who started by modifying Series 1 Land Rovers in 1985 for off-road competition. After a little bit of success in the off-road world, he founded a company, Bowler, with 8 employees building rally-raid vehicles out of old Land Rovers. They launched the Tomcat with weight reduction, endurance fuel tanks, upgraded suspension, and reinforced tubular chassis. Then they made that into the Wildcat, which was just sort of an evolution of the Tomcat. This still used Land Rover underpinnings as a starting point, but there was a new 5-liter V8 making over 200 horsepower and 300 torque. But then they reset the rulebook. Completely ditched the Wildcat and Tomcat design with the Nemesis. It takes styling cues from the Range Rover Sport, as you can sort of see. However, it has a carbon fiber body, independent suspension, and several engine options, such as a 4-liter and a 4.4-liter naturally aspirated V8. But if you want the crown jewel, there's a 4.2-liter supercharged V8, designed for the Dakar, making 515 horsepower. It can do 140 miles an hour off-road, and has a 440-liter Dakar endurance fuel tank that can last the longest of any rally raid stages. And for the first time, they made a road version that you can buy. Not many of them, in fact. Very few, in fact. It was called the EXR-S. It had a 5-liter supercharged V8 from the Jaguar XKR. It makes 550 horsepower, nearly 700 foot-pounds of torque. And the torque split was reworked from 50-50 from the off-road version to 60-40 for the road version, and it still used the weight reduction like carbon fiber construction and roll cages and aluminum components, meaning that this 550 horsepower monster weighed an entire ton lighter than the Range Rover Sport. That meant a 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds. And since every single one is custom order, they cost $236,000, which is an incredibly expensive toy, but I want one really, really badly. And I'm not the only one that wants them. Land Rover wants them, because they bought out Bowler in 2019. And Bowler announced their second road car, the Project CSP575, had the brand new Land Rover Sport SVR's V8 mounted in the Defender station wagon. That's gonna be insane. Can you imagine a Defender station wagon with like 10 seats and all-wheel drive just blasting by you at 150 miles an hour? That's gonna be awesome. Keeping the tradition, the off-road heritage, the core of Range Rover and Land Rover alive and well.